Jake Morrison ran through the tall grass behind his family's farm. House on New Haven. The 8-year-old boy loved the way the purple grass moved in the wind like ocean waves. His mother Lisa called from the kitchen window that dinner would be ready soon. His father Ben was coming home from the mining station where he worked every day digging precious metals from the ground. New Haven was a peaceful place where families came to start new lives far from the crowded cities of Earth. The sky began to change color as 3 suns set behind the mountains. Jake picked flowers for his mother like he did every evening. She always smiled when he brought them to her. The flowers on New Haven were different from Earth flowers. These ones glowed softly in the dark and smelled like sweet candy. Jake had lived on New Haven for 3 years since his family moved here. When he was 5, he could barely remember Earth anymore. Something strange appeared in the sky. Jake stopped picking flowers and looked up. Dark shapes moved between the clouds. They were not the usual transport ships that brought supplies to the colony. These ships were bigger and had a mean look to them. They made no sound as they flew overhead. Jake felt scared but did not know why. The ships were black and covered with sharp points like the teeth of a monster. Jake's father Ben came running home from the mining station. His face was full of fear. He grabbed Jake by the shoulders and looked into his eyes. Ben told Jake to run to the emergency shelter behind their house and hide there no matter what happened. Jake asked what was wrong, but his father pushed him toward the shelter. Lisa came out of the house carrying a bag of food and water. She kissed Jake on the forehead and told him she loved him very much. The black ships landed in the fields around the settlement. Doors opened on the sides of the ships and strange creatures came out. They walked on 2 legs like humans but looked like giant lizards. Their skin was green and covered with scales. They had long tails and sharp claws on their hands. Red eyes glowed in their reptile faces. Each creature carried weapons that looked like nothing Jake had ever seen before. Ben pushed Jake into the emergency shelter and closed the heavy door. The shelter was dark and cold. Jake could hear terrible sounds coming from outside. There were loud bangs and bright flashes of light. People were screaming. Jake covered his ears, but the sounds would not go away. He wanted to help his parents, but the door was locked from the outside. His father had made sure Jake could not get out even if he tried. The lizard creatures were called Zephyrians. They came from a planet far away where they ruled a huge empire. The Zephyrians traveled from world to world looking for young beings to capture and make into slaves. They had been watching New Haven for months. They knew exactly when to attack. And how many people lived in the settlement? The Zephyrians were very good at what they did because they had been doing it for hundreds of years. Jake stayed in the shelter for many hours. The terrible sounds outside slowly stopped. Everything became quiet. Jake was hungry and thirsty but afraid to make any noise. Maybe the monsters were still out there waiting for him. He curled up in the corner of the shelter and tried to sleep, but nightmares filled his mind. He dreamed of red eyes and sharp claws reaching for him in the darkness. When morning came, Jake heard new sounds outside. Heavy footsteps walked around the shelter. Something was scratching at the door. Jake held his breath and did not move. The scratching got louder. Suddenly the door exploded open and bright light filled the shelter. A huge Zephyrian looked down at Jake with glowing red eyes. The creature made sounds that Jake did not understand, but they sounded angry and mean. The Zephyrian reached into the shelter with long, clawed arms and grabbed Jake. Jake tried to fight, but he was too small and weak. The creature carried him outside, where Jake saw something that made him cry. His house was burned and broken. His parents were lying on the ground and they were not moving. Jake screamed for his mother and father, but they could not hear him anymore. The Zephyrian hit Jake and told him to be quiet in words Jake somehow understood. Other children from the settlement were being loaded into the black ships. Jake recognized some of his friends from school. They were all crying and calling for their parents. The Zephyrians pushed them into metal cages inside the ships. Jake was thrown into a cage with 5 other human children. The cage was so small they could barely move. It smelled bad, and there was no food or water. The ship lifted off from New Haven and flew up into space. Jake looked through a small window and watched his home planet get smaller and smaller until it was just a tiny dot. He would never see New Haven again. He would never see his parents again. The other children in the cage cried and held each other. Jake did not cry anymore. Something had changed inside him when he saw his dead parents. The sadness was still there, but now there was something else. Something hard and cold like ice. The Zephyrian ship flew through space for many days. The children were given just enough food and water to keep them alive. Many of them got sick from the bad air and dirty conditions. Jake tried to help the younger children, but there was not much he could do. He watched the Zephyrians and listened to everything they said. He began to learn their language without them knowing. Jake was very smart for an 8-year-old boy, and his mind was like a recording machine that remembered everything. Finally, the ship arrived at a huge planet covered with red cities and black smoke. This was Craxus Prime, the homeworld of the Zephyrian Empire. The planet was ugly and mean-looking, just like the creatures who lived there. The children were taken off the ship and brought to a big building where they would be sold like animals. Jake looked around at everything and remembered every detail. Someday he would find a way to escape from this place. Someday he would make the Zephyrians pay for what they had done to his family and his world. 3 years had passed since Jake Morrison was brought to the crystal mines beneath High Commander Vexstar S. Palace. The 11-year-old boy no longer looked like the scared child who had been dragged from his burning home on New Haven. His body had grown strong from the hard work in the mines. His hands were covered with scars from handling the sharp crystal formations. His eyes had changed the most. They were harder now and always watching everything around him. Jake worked 12 hours every day in the deep tunnels where the valuable crystals grew. The crystals were used to power Zephyrian ships and weapons. The work was dangerous because the crystal dust was poison to most living things. Many alien slaves died from breathing too much of the dust. But Jake's human body seemed to handle the poison better than the others. The Zephyrians were surprised that he was still alive after 3 years. Most young slaves died within months. The crystal mines were full of slaves from many different worlds. Jake had learned to speak with all of them. His best friend was a creature called Nyx, who looked like a giant spider with 8 arms. Nyx was very old and had been in the mines for 20 years. Nyx taught Jake about the galaxy and all the different alien races. Nyx told him that the Zephyrian Empire controlled hundreds of worlds and billions of slaves. Another friend was Gorn, a huge creature who stood 3 times taller than Jake. Gorn's people were called Titans, and they were known for being gentle. Despite their great size, Gorn protected Jake from the mean Zephyrian guards who liked to hurt the smaller slaves. When Jake was too tired to carry the heavy crystal containers, Gorn would help him. The Zephyrians did not stop Gorn because they needed his strength to move the biggest crystals. The most interesting friend Jake made was a creature named Zara. Zara looked almost human except for her blue skin and large purple eyes. Zara's people were called Mindari, and they could read thoughts. Zara was careful not to let the Zephyrians know about her special ability. She taught Jake how different alien minds worked. She explained that Zephyrians were not very smart, but they were very mean, and they never gave up when they wanted something. Jake spent every free moment learning from his alien friends. He asked them thousands of questions about their homeworlds, their cultures, and their weaknesses. Jake's human brain was like a computer that could store huge amounts of information. He remembered every detail about guard schedules, security, systems, and the layout of the mining complex. He drew maps in his mind of every tunnel and every room. The Zephyrian guards thought Jake was just a quiet slave who followed orders. They did not know that he understood every word they said. Jake had learned their language perfectly, but he pretended to be stupid. The guards often talked about military secrets and important information while Jake was working nearby. They never imagined that a human child could be listening and understanding everything. Jake also learned about other human slaves in different parts of the empire. Sometimes new slaves would arrive at the mines and they would tell stories about humans they had seen in other places. Jake memorized every location and every name. He was building a map in his mind of where all the human slaves were being kept. Someday this information would be very important. The work in the crystal mines was getting easier for Jake as he grew bigger and stronger. He had figured out better ways to extract the crystals without breaking them. The Zephyrians were pleased, because broken crystals were worthless. Jake's section of the mine was producing more crystals than any other section. The guards began to treat him a little better because he was making them look good to their commanders, but Jake was not trying to help the Zephyrians. Everything he did was part of a bigger plan. By working harder and causing no trouble, Jake earned small privileges. He was allowed to move around the mining complex more freely. He could visit different sections where other types of slaves worked. This gave him chances to learn about the palace above the mines and the weapons that were stored there. Jake also began to understand Zephyrian psychology in ways that surprised even Zara. He noticed that Zephyrians were very proud creatures who could not stand to be embarrassed in front of other Zephyrians. They were also very superstitious and believed in many strange things about luck and omens. Jake filed all of this information away in his memory for future use. One day, Jake discovered something that changed everything. While cleaning crystals, in a storage room, he found a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside the compartment were weapons that had been stolen from captured ships. There were human weapons, Mindari energy rifles, and even some Zephyrian military equipment. The weapons were old, but Jake thought they might still work. Jake did not take any of the weapons because he knew the Zephyrians would notice if something was missing. Instead, he memorized exactly what was there and how to get to the secret compartment. He also began to look for other hidden places where weapons might be stored. Over the next few months, he found 3 more secret weapon caches in different parts of the mining complex. The Zephyrians had made a big mistake. When they brought Jake to the crystal mines, they thought the dangerous work and terrible conditions would break his spirit like it did to most slaves. Instead, the mines had become Jake's school. He was learning everything he needed to know about his enemies. He was becoming strong in body and mind. Most importantly, he was building friendships with other slaves who would help him when the time came. Jake's 13th birthday came and went without anyone noticing. He did not celebrate because there was nothing to celebrate yet, but he made himself a promise on that day. Before his next birthday, he would begin the first step of his plan to escape from this place. He would not leave alone. He would take his friends with him. And someday he would come back with enough power to free every slave in the Zephyrian Empire. The Zephyrians thought they owned Jake Morrison. They thought he was just another slave who would work until he died in their minds. They had no idea that they were creating something they had never faced before. They were creating a human who understood exactly how their empire worked and exactly how to destroy it. The scared little boy from New Haven was gone, and his place was something much more dangerous. Jake Morrison was now 15 years old and no longer the small boy who had been dragged into the crystal mines. 7 years of hard labor had built his body into something powerful and dangerous. His shoulders were broad and his arms were thick, with muscle from lifting heavy crystal containers every day. But the real change was in his mind. Jake had become something the Zephyrians never expected to see in their minds. The teenage human could speak 17 different alien languages perfectly. He knew the guard schedules for every level of the mining complex. He had memorized the locations of weapon caches throughout the facility. Most importantly, Jake had earned the respect and loyalty of slaves from a dozen different species. They looked to him for leadership. Even though he was still young by their standards, Jake's work section was now the most productive in the entire mining operation. He had taught the other slaves in his area new techniques for extracting crystals safely and quickly. The Zephyrian overseers were happy because their reports to High Commander Vexstar always showed excellent results. They never suspected that Jake was using his success to move freely through areas that were normally restricted to slaves, but everything changed on the day that High Commander Vexstar decided to make an example of someone. The cruel Zephyrian commander wanted to show the slaves what happened to those who worked too slowly. He chose Gorn, the gentle titan who had protected Jake for years. Gorn had been sick lately and could not work as fast as usual. Vexstar announced that Gorn would be executed in front of all the slaves as a warning to the others. Jake felt something break inside his chest when he heard the announcement. For 7 years he had controlled his emotions and waited for the right moment to act. He had planned to wait until he was older and stronger, but watching his friend being dragged to the execution chamber was more than Jake could bear. The careful control he had built over the years shattered like broken crystal. That night, Jake went to the hidden weapon cache he had discovered years earlier. The weapons were still there, covered with dust but functional. Jake took what he needed and began moving through the mining complex like a shadow. He had studied the guard patterns for so long that he could move anywhere without being seen. He visited every section of the mines and spoke quietly to the slaves he trusted most. Jake told them the plan was simple. Tomorrow, when the guards brought Gorn to the execution chamber, the slaves would fight back. Jake had made improvised explosives from crystal dust mixed with chemicals he had stolen from the processing center. The explosions would destroy the main power systems and lock down the security doors. In the confusion, the slaves would take weapons from the hidden caches and fight their way to freedom. Many of the alien slaves were afraid. They had been beaten down for so many years that they could barely imagine fighting back. But Nyx, the spider creature, spoke up for Jake. Nyx reminded the others that Jake had never lied to them and had always kept his promises. Zara, the mind reader, told them that she could sense the strength of Jake's determination. Even if the plan failed, it was better to die fighting than to live as slaves forever. When morning came, the execution ceremony began as planned. High Commander Vexstar stood on a platform above the main chamber where all the slaves were forced to watch. Gorn was chained to a post in the center of the chamber. The Zephyrian guards pointed their weapons at the huge titan who had never hurt anyone in his life. Vexstar began a speech about the importance of obedience and hard work. Jake waited until Vexstar was in the middle of his speech. Then he triggered the first explosive device he had hidden near the main power generator. The lights went out and emergency alarms began screaming throughout the complex. In the darkness, Jake triggered 2 more explosions that destroyed the security control room and blocked the main exits. The Zephyrian guards could not see what was happening and began shooting randomly into the crowd of slaves, but the slaves were ready. Jake had taught them to move quickly to the weapon caches when the explosions started. Within minutes, aliens who had been helpless slaves were carrying energy rifles and plasma grenades. Jake appeared on the platform next to High Commander Vexstar with a weapon pointed at the Zephyrian's head. He spoke in perfect Zephyrian language and told Vexstar that the slaves were taking control of the mining complex. The battle lasted for 6 hours. The Zephyrian guards were well trained and heavily armed, but they had never faced anything like this before. Jake moved through the fighting like he had been born for war. He seemed to know exactly where every enemy would be and what they would do next. His 7 years of watching and learning had prepared him perfectly for this moment. The slave uprising succeeded beyond anyone's dreams. They captured the entire mining complex and freed over 300 slaves from many different worlds. Jake's explosives had damaged the communication system so badly that it took hours for news of the revolt to reach the palace above. By then, it was too late to stop what had started, but Jake knew the victory would not last long. More Zephyrian troops would come from other parts of the Empire. The mining complex could not be defended for more than a few days. Jake had planned for this too. He sent messages to slave populations in other parts of Craxus Prime using communication equipment they had captured. The message was simple. The time for freedom had come. The revolt spread faster than anyone thought possible. 3 more mining facilities joined the uprising within hours. Slaves in the weapon factories and food processing centers began fighting back against their guards. For the first time in hundreds of years, the Zephyrian Empire was facing organized resistance from the beings they had enslaved. Jake knew they could not win a long war against the entire Zephyrian military, but that was not the point. The point was to show every slave in the galaxy that the Zephyrians could be beaten. The point was to prove that resistance was possible. Even when the Zephyrian army finally crushed the uprising, the idea would remain alive in the minds of millions of enslaved beings when the end came. Jake made sure his friends escaped through tunnels they had prepared. He stayed behind to destroy the crystal processing equipment so the Zephyrians could not use it again quickly. Jake was captured while setting the final explosive charges, but he was smiling when the Zephyrian soldiers found him. He had accomplished something that would change everything. High Commander Vexstar looked at the human teenager who had destroyed years of work and killed dozens of Zephyrian guards. The commander could not understand how a slave could have planned and executed such a successful attack. Jake looked back at Vexstar with eyes that showed no fear. He told the Zephyrian that this was only the beginning. Someday humans would come for all their enslaved children, and the Zephyrian Empire would fall. The prison moon of Torak was the worst place in the Zephyrian Empire. It was where they sent the most dangerous criminals and the slaves who caused too much trouble. The moon had no atmosphere and no natural light. Everything was built underground in tunnels carved from solid rock. The Zephyrians thought that no one could escape from Torak because there was nowhere to go, even if someone got out of the prison. Jake Morrison arrived at Torak 6 months after his failed uprising at the crystal mines. He was now 16 years old, and the Zephyrians had classified him as their most dangerous prisoner. They put him in a special cell that was watched by cameras all the time. Guards checked on him every hour. They gave him just enough food and water to keep him alive, but not enough to keep him strong. But the Zephyrians had made another mistake. They thought that by putting Jake in their most secure prison, they were making him powerless. Instead, they had brought him to exactly where he needed to be. Torak was where the Zephyrians kept all the slaves who had shown leadership abilities. It was where they brought the ones who caused rebellions on other worlds. Without knowing it, the Zephyrians had gathered Jake's future army in one place. The biggest surprise came when Jake was taken to the common area where prisoners were allowed to exercise for 1 hour each day. Among the hundreds of alien prisoners, Jake saw something that made his heart race with excitement. There were other humans in the prison, not just a few, but dozens of them. Men and women who had been captured from human colonies over the years. Some of them had been prisoners for more than 20 years. Jake approached the human prisoners carefully. They looked at him with suspicion at first because they had learned not to trust anyone in this place. Many of them had been broken by years of torture and despair. They moved like ghosts and barely spoke to each other. But when Jake began speaking to them in English, something changed in their eyes. It had been years since most of them had heard their native language spoken by another human. The oldest human prisoner was a woman named Carol Peters, who had been captured when Jake was still a baby. Carol had been a military officer on a human colony that was attacked by Zephyrian raiders. She had fought so hard during the capture that the Zephyrians decided to keep her alive as a trophy. Over the years, Carol had watched dozens of other humans arrive at the prison. Most of them died within a few years from despair or the terrible conditions. Jake spent weeks talking to Carol and the other human prisoners. He learned that there were nearly 200 humans scattered throughout the Zephyrian prison system. Some were in work camps on mining worlds. Others were kept as entertainment slaves in the cities of wealthy Zephyrians. A few had been sent to research facilities where alien scientists studied human biology and psychology, but Jake also learned something that filled him with hope. The human colonies that had not been attacked were still free and growing stronger. Earth had established a military fleet that was searching for the missing colonists. Several times, human ships had fought battles with Zephyrian raiders and won. The Zephyrian Empire was no longer the only major power in this part of the galaxy. Jake began the slow work of rebuilding the spirits of his fellow humans. He told them about his uprising at the crystal mines and how slaves could fight back successfully if they worked together. He shared his knowledge of Zephyrian weaknesses and tactical mistakes. Most importantly, he gave them something they had lost years ago: hope for freedom and revenge. Carol Peters became Jake's strongest supporter among the human prisoners. She had kept her military training alive in her mind even after 20 years of captivity. Carol helped Jake organize the humans into a disciplined group. They began exercising together and sharing their different skills and knowledge. The former soldiers taught combat techniques while the engineers and scientists contributed technical expertise. Jake also reached out to the non-human prisoners who had shown leadership potential. His old friend Nix had been captured during the mining facility uprising and brought to Torak. Zara the mind reader was there too, along with several other aliens who had joined Jake's rebellion. Together, they formed the core of a new resistance network that spread throughout the prison. The network grew carefully and secretly over many months. Jake used his understanding of alien psychology to recruit prisoners from different species. He knew which guards could be bribed and which ones were completely loyal to the Zephyrians. He learned the schedules of supply ships and communication systems. Most importantly, he established contact with resistance groups on other worlds. The breakthrough came when Jake convinced a Zephyrian guard named Crix to help the resistance. Crix was not like the other guards. He was young and had joined the prison service because he needed work, not because he enjoyed hurting prisoners. Jake spent months talking to Crix and showing him evidence of Zephyrian war crimes. Eventually, Crix agreed to help smuggle messages in and out of the prison. Through Crix, Jake was able to send information to the free human colonies about the locations of all the enslaved humans in the Zephyrian Empire. He provided detailed intelligence about Zephyrian military bases, fleet positions, and defensive capabilities. The information was incredibly valuable to human military planners who were preparing for a larger conflict with the Zephyrian Empire. Jake also received messages from the outside that filled him with determination. The human colonies had united into a single government called the United Human Colonial Fleet. They had built hundreds of new warships and trained thousands of soldiers. Most importantly, they had declared their intention to rescue every human. Being held prisoner by the Zephyrians, no matter how long it took or how much it cost, but Jake was not content to wait for rescue. He was planning something much bigger than a simple prison break. He was organizing a coordinated uprising that would happen simultaneously across the entire Zephyrian Empire. Every slave camp, every prison, every work facility would rebel at the same moment. The Zephyrians would face attacks from within their own territory, while the human fleet attacked from outside. The plan required perfect timing and communication across dozens of worlds. Jake used his network of alien contacts to spread the word to resistance groups throughout the Empire. He sent detailed instructions about weapons, tactics, and targets. He provided maps and security codes that his allies had gathered over years of careful observation. The Zephyrians knew something was happening, but they could not figure out what. They had detected increased communication between different slave populations, but they could not decode the messages. They had noticed that some slaves were acting differently, but they could not identify the leaders. Jake had learned too well how to hide his activities from his captors. As Jake's 18th birthday approached, he knew the time for action was almost ready. The human fleet was moving into position near Zephyrian space. Resistance cells on dozens of worlds were armed and waiting for the signal. The slaves who had suffered for so long under Zephyrian rule were ready to fight for their freedom. Jake looked at the other human prisoners during their daily exercise period and saw something that made him proud. These were no longer broken spirits who had given up hope. They were soldiers preparing for war. They were survivors who had endured the worst the Zephyrians could do and emerged stronger. They were ready to show their captors that enslaving humans came with a price that the Zephyrian Empire could not afford to pay. Jake Morrison was 23 years old when the United Human Colonial Fleet finally arrived at the borders of Zephyrian space. 15 years had passed since he was taken from his home on New Haven as a frightened child. Now he stood in his cell on Torak Prison Moon and felt the vibrations through the rock that told him the war had begun. Human warships were attacking Zephyrian patrol fleets in the outer systems. The Liberation War had started, but Jake was not waiting to be rescued. He had spent years preparing for this moment when human forces would provide the distraction he needed. The network of resistance fighters he had built throughout the Zephyrian Empire was ready to strike. On dozens of worlds, enslaved beings were waiting for the signal that would begin the largest slave uprising in galactic history. The signal came at exactly the right moment. As human ships engaged Zephyrian fleets near the border, Jake triggered the communication device he had secretly built from stolen parts. The message went out simultaneously to every resistance cell in the Empire. The day of freedom has come. Strike now while they are distracted. Show them that slaves can break their own chains. What happened next shocked even Jake with its power and coordination. On the mining world of Kepler-7, 3,000 alien slaves overwhelmed their guards and captured the planetary defense systems. On the factory moon of Dracos Prime, enslaved workers destroyed the weapon production facilities that supplied half the Zephyrian military. In the capital city of Craxus Prime itself, household slaves rose up against their masters and opened the gates for human special forces teams. The uprising at Torak Prison Moon was led by Jake himself, using explosives he had carefully prepared over months. He destroyed the main security systems and freed over 2,000 prisoners. Many of them were experienced fighters who had been captured in various rebellions over the years. They fought with the fury of beings who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Carol Peters, the human military officer who had become Jake's second-in-command, led a team that captured the prison's communication center. From there, she was able to contact the approaching human fleet and provide them with detailed intelligence about Zephyrian defenses. The information Jake's network had gathered over the years proved invaluable to human military commanders. High Commander Vexstar, the Zephyrian noble who had originally purchased Jake as a mining slave, found his palace under attack from multiple directions. Human marines were landing in his courtyard while his own household slaves were fighting his guards in the corridors. But the most terrifying sight for Vexstar was seeing Jake Morrison walking through the ruins of his crystal processing facility, now wearing the uniform of a colonel in the Human Liberation Forces, the Zephyrian Empire, which had ruled through fear and superior technology for centuries, discovered that their advantages meant nothing when their enemies understood exactly how they thought and fought. Jake had spent 15 years learning every detail of Zephyrian psychology, military doctrine, and cultural weaknesses. He knew which commanders would panic under pressure and which ones would fight to the death. He knew which planets had weak defenses and which ones were too strong to attack directly. The war that the Zephyrians expected to last for years was over in less than 6 months. The combination of external attack by the human fleet and internal rebellion by the enslaved populations created a collapse that spread faster than anyone had imagined possible. World after world either surrendered to human forces or was liberated by its own slave population rising up against their masters. Jake found himself promoted to general and given command of all liberated slave forces fighting alongside the human military. His reputation had grown to legendary status among the enslaved populations throughout the galaxy. Beings from dozens of different worlds volunteered to serve under his command. They believed that the human who had survived 15 years of slavery and emerged stronger would lead them to victory against any enemy. The final battle took place on Craxus Prime, the Zephyrian homeworld. The planet's defenses had been weakened by constant slave uprisings and the withdrawal of forces to fight human fleets in other systems. When human marines landed in the capital city, they found that most of the defensive positions had already been captured by liberated slaves, who knew the city's layout better than the defenders did. High Commander Vexstar made his last stand in his palace throne room, surrounded by his most loyal guards. When Jake entered the room, Vexstar could barely recognize the powerful human warrior as the small boy he had bought in a slave market 15 years earlier. Jake offered the Zephyrian commander a choice: surrender and face trial for crimes against sentient beings, or fight and face the justice of the thousands of slaves who had died in his mines. Vexstar chose to fight, but his weapons and guards were no match for Jake's tactical brilliance and the fury of the liberated slaves who fought beside him. The battle was brief and decisive. When it ended, the symbol of Zephyrian power over enslaved beings was gone forever. Jake stood in the ruins of the palace where he had suffered for so many years and felt a satisfaction deeper than any revenge. The Galactic Council, an organization of the major spacefaring civilizations, held an emergency session to deal with the collapse of the Zephyrian Empire. Many of the council members had secretly profited from the Zephyrian slave trade, but now they faced a new reality. Humanity had proven itself as a major military power, and the other enslaved species were demanding their own freedom and independence. Jake stood before the Galactic Council as the representative of all liberated beings. He was no longer the frightened child who had been dragged from his burning home, but he was also not consumed by hatred and revenge. He spoke calmly about the crimes that had been committed and the justice that was required. He offered the galaxy a choice: help build a new order based on freedom and cooperation, or face the consequences of continuing the old ways of exploitation and slavery. The council voted unanimously to outlaw slavery throughout the galaxy and to help rebuild the worlds that had been damaged by the Zephyrian Empire. New governments were established on dozens of worlds, led by the beings who had once been slaves but had proven they could govern themselves. Jake was offered positions of power and leadership, but he declined most of them. He had done what he set out to do. The final scene of Jake's long journey came when he returned to New Haven, the world where his story had begun. The colony had been rebuilt by human settlers who came looking for the children who had been taken. So many years before, Jake walked through fields of purple grass that looked exactly like his childhood memories. He visited the place where his family's farm had stood and placed flowers on graves that marked where his parents had died fighting to protect their home. But Jake was not alone on New Haven. Many of the humans who had been enslaved with him had chosen to settle there and help rebuild the colony. Terrell Peters had become the planet's new governor. Other freed slaves from different species had also come to New Haven, making it a symbol of cooperation between different peoples who had survived oppression together. As Jake stood in the field where he had picked flowers for his mother 23 years earlier, he reflected on the strange path his life had taken. The Zephyrians had thought they were capturing a weak human child to work in their mines. Instead, they had taken the one person who would learn everything about their empire and use that knowledge to bring about their destruction. They had created their own worst nightmare by enslaving a human being who refused to give up hope and never stopped planning for the day when he would be strong enough to fight back.